But now we're going to invite Brother Iannelli up. He's going to discuss with us the theme, She Did What She Could. Brother Iannelli, please.
From time to time at headquarters, we receive letters that are especially heartfelt, and you get the feeling that the individual has just kind of pulled out all the stops and just poured his or her heart out. I have one such letter here. I'd like to read it to you. Now, your circumstances may be different from this sister's, but see if you can, on some level, identify with her feelings, okay? She writes, "We recently returned from our circuit assembly dealing with carrying our own loads. The advice was very timely. I deeply appreciate the loving care that Jehovah's organization has been taking of us little sheep for many years, alerting us to what we must do. It strikes me as very ironic, though, that often the ones who lead such assemblies with their consciences really pained are those who are stretched out to the max. In fact, I was left very depressed. Now I fully realize that this is my problem, not yours, dear brothers. I obviously took it wrong, but I left feeling woefully inadequate. I pray often to Jehovah to correct my thinking. Guilt is such a damaging emotion, and I can tell you it affects many fine brothers and sisters. Why can't we, why don't we do more in service? It is not always a lack of faith or devotion, brothers. Do you know how time-consuming poverty is? I am a mother of 3. I drive our children to and from school. They are in 3 different schools. This time is extremely valuable as we read the text, we pray, we discuss current holidays, pressures, homework, and so forth. Back to the poverty aspect of life, though, I find that I must conserve wherever I can. This means that I must spend time searching through thrift shops, clearance racks, or sewing clothes so that our family can be suitably attired for field service in our ritzy territory. My 14-year-old son recently acquired the privilege of handling microphones at the Kingdom Hall, and he needs appropriate suits, shirts, and shoes, which he consistently outgrows every 2 months. We need warm winter clothing brought out of the closets, washed, ironed, and ready for the 5 of us. We very strongly agree that mealtimes together are important, and we believe that eating lots of fruits and freshly prepared vegetables are important to staying healthy. But this necessitates my driving 20 miles to a farmer's market. Then I spend an hour or 2 a week working on coupons, cutting, filing, trading them. This results in cutting our grocery store bills 30%. I don't mean to bore you with my life, brothers, but do you see the problem? I feel very guilty doing all the above, thinking that it could be time spent in service. I feel guilty thinking about the hour I spend writing this letter, that it could have been spent out in service. And soon this downward spiral has me really depressed, and my dear husband is wondering what to do with me. Also, something I never complain about is the extra load I willingly carry in our household so that my husband can continue serving as an elder. I absolutely know that Jehovah's blessing has been rich on our family because of his serving, and I do not begrudge what he gives. I always remember the quote in a Watchtower article of a mother advising her newly married daughter, never be jealous of Jehovah. Yet realistically, I need to rake more leaves, do more disciplining, studying, transporting with the children, because my husband is busy. This is something I cannot explain to other wives, because I would never want them to hold their husbands back from progressing. So I silently endure the, "Why aren't you pioneering?" comments, or I feebly try to defend myself. I did auxiliary pioneer in September, but I fell so far behind on paperwork, housework, and laundry, it took 2 months to put the house back together. Now, maybe I'm disorganized. Somehow I cannot seem to get it together like the sisters I read about who pioneer with 5 children, a full-time job, and an unbelieving husband. So instead, I feel enormously guilty and unworthy of Jehovah's favor. The problems of depression are so serious today. If a mother falls into this hole, the entire family suffers, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. There must be some way, though, to lift the guilt off of many diligent, hard-working brothers and sisters who are stretched to the limit. You don't need to reply to this letter. I have already taken your time away from important spiritual things. With Jehovah's sustaining power, we will all resist Satan's devious attacks on our minds, our families, and our congregations. And then she signs the letter. Now let me ask you, have you ever felt that way? Guilty that maybe you're not doing enough to please Jehovah? Now maybe it's not poverty that limits you. Maybe it's health. Maybe it's family responsibilities. Maybe it's advancing age. But when you're not able to do all that your heart yearns to do, it is so easy to feel guilty. You know, guilt can actually displace love as a motive in serving God. Now, let me make clear that I'm not talking about someone who chooses to do less because he's distracted by the things of the world. When the elders see situations like that, they rightly offer help and counsel. Now, let me make clear, what we're talking about here is the conscientious Christian who yearns to do more, but who beats himself up because he can't. Now that raises some questions. What does Jehovah expect from us? Why do so many conscientious Christians feel so guilty about their service to God? How can you know if you personally are doing enough to please Jehovah? Well, to answer these questions, we might start with turning to Mark chapter 14, and let's note what Jehovah expects of us. And this was beautifully indicated by something that happened to Jesus a few days before he died. Mark chapter 14. And we're going to read verses 3 through 9, and then we'll analyze what happened. Mark 14, starting with verse 3. And while he, Jesus, was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the meal, a woman came with an alabaster case of perfumed oil, genuine nard, very expensive. Breaking open the alabaster case, she began to pour it upon his head. At this, there were some expressing indignation among themselves. Why has this waste of the perfumed oil taken place? For this perfumed oil could have been sold for upward of 300 denarii and been given to the poor. And they were feeling great displeasure at her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you try to make trouble for her? She did a fine deed toward me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want to, you can always do them good. But me you do not have always." She did what she could. She undertook beforehand to put perfumed oil on my body in view of the burial. Truly I say to you, wherever the good news is preached in all the world, what this woman did shall also be told as a remembrance of her. Now let's take a closer look at this beautiful account. In verse 3, it says that this meal took place at the house of Simon the leper. Now that does not mean that Simon was at that moment a leper, otherwise he'd have been unclean, right? Probably what it means is that Simon used to be a leper and likely had been healed by Jesus. And now Jesus was a guest in this man's home. Now it says in verse 3 that a woman came in with the case containing the oil. She's not named in Mark's account, but she is named in the parallel account in the Gospel of John. Does anyone recall the name of this woman? You remember who this was? Anyone? Take a stab at it? Please. Just call it Mary. However, there are a number of Marys mentioned in the Bible. Which one was this? Well, it's very interesting and helpful to know. This was Mary, the sister of Lazarus. Now, Jesus had already resurrected her brother from the dead. And that sure helps to explain why this woman did what she did for Jesus. I mean, just ask yourself, what would you have been willing to give to the man who had given you your brother back from the dead? Now, it says in verse 3, the latter part, that she poured the oil upon Jesus' head. Interestingly, Matthew and Mark in their Gospels say that she poured the oil on his head, but John in his Gospel says that she poured the oil upon his feet. Now, is that a contradiction? Of course not. What it obviously means is that she poured the oil both upon his head and upon his feet. Now, one scholar says this: to pour ointment on the head was common, but to pour it on the feet was an act of distinguished humility and attachment to the Savior. But again, there was not enough that this woman could do to show her appreciation to the man who had raised her brother from the dead. But not everybody was happy. Verse 4 says there were some expressing indignation. And John in his Gospel makes clear who the ringleader was. And who was the ringleader? Do you recall? It's not a trick question. Who was the ringleader here in expressing indignation? I heard it. Judas. That's right. And what's the argument given? Well, the argument given was that the oil could have been sold and the money given to the poor. Now, is that really what Judas had in mind? No. He was the keeper of the money box. If the oil had been sold, the money would first have been put into that box and from there distributed to the poor, but Judas, with his sticky fingers, would have helped himself to the money. And that really is what he was lamenting. Now, we're talking about a considerable sum of money here, because in verse 5, it says that the oil could have been sold for upward of 300 denarii. Now, when you consider that the average worker in the first century earned 1 denarius a day, and you figure 6 days a week for 52 weeks of the year, 300 denarii was roughly a year's wage. Now, that's a lot of money. To put into some perspective the purchasing power of that much money, consider this. Do you remember the miracle where Jesus fed the 5,000 with just a few fishes and a few loaves? Well, interestingly, the Gospel of John in chapter 6 has a very interesting detail. On that occasion when Jesus performed that miracle and fed the crowd, before feeding the people, Jesus turned to Philip, who was from the area where they were, and Jesus said, "Philip, where can we buy some bread for these people?" And interestingly, the account at John 6 verse 7 says, Philip looked at Jesus and said, "Lord, 200 denarii would hardly be enough to feed all these people." Now, the crowd was 5,000 men besides women and children. So it was a crowd of well over 10,000 people, undoubtedly. 200 denarii would not have been quite enough to feed more than 10,000 people. Mary's oil was worth a third more than that. Where she got it, we don't know. What we do know, there wasn't enough that she could do to show her appreciation to the man who had given her her brother back from the dead. Now, what we're mostly interested in here is how Jesus viewed what she did. It's in verse 8, and our theme words. Jesus said of Mary, "She did what she could." What did Jesus mean by that? You know, in English, when you tell someone just do what you can, it almost has a negative connotation, right? It almost sounds like you're saying, you know what, don't push yourself, just do what you can. Is that what Jesus meant when saying this about Mary? No. Some other translations render this, she has done all she could. Another said, she has done all that she had it in her power to do. In other words, Mary did not hold back one drop of oil for herself. She used it all on Jesus, and Jesus appreciated it. Now, interestingly, 2 days after this encounter with Mary, 2 days later, Jesus encountered a different woman at the temple, a very poor widow. And this widow, in contrast to Mary, dropped into the treasury chest 2 coins of very little value. But what is so interesting, friends, is that what Jesus said about that widow indicates that he valued her 2 coins of little value no less than he valued Mary's costly oil. Why? Because Jesus knew about that widow. She did what she could, and Jesus appreciated it. Now remember, Jesus perfectly reflected Jehovah's mind on matters. What Jesus said about these 2 women, Mary and the widow, teach us something very important about what Jehovah expects, and it is this. Jehovah expects you to give him as much as you realistically can give. Nothing less, nothing more. Now, that raises some questions, though. Why do we feel so guilty about our service to God? Well, there might be several reasons. For one, it might be the feelings of worthlessness we talked about yesterday. Perhaps as a result of things we've experienced in life, the way we've been treated by others. If we have a very low view of ourselves, it is so easy to be convinced that no matter how much you give to Jehovah, it could not possibly be enough. In other cases, the guilt may stem from perfectionism, the need to be the perfect Christian. Here's a letter we received from a sister who grew up in an alcoholic home. And she describes in the beginning of her letter how her father was violent and abusive toward the family. But as often happens in such homes, the children blame themselves for what's going on. And she recalls that as a little girl, she found herself wanting to be perfect because she imagined, if I'm the perfect little girl, then maybe my dad won't get angry. If he doesn't get angry, maybe he won't drink. If he doesn't drink, maybe he won't hit us. Hit mom, hit us. Well, she grew up, she came into the truth, and you know what she brought into the truth with her? Her perfectionism, her need to be perfect. She writes, she's a regular pioneer. If I'm behind on my goals for the year, I push myself beyond all reasonable limits to make those goals, even though I allow others to be reasonable with themselves. It is next to impossible for me to be sick without feeling tremendous guilt that I'm not exerting myself vigorously. I don't expect this from my brothers and sisters. After all, Jehovah only expects from them what they can give. I always feel that Jehovah expects more of me. Sometimes it may be the perfectionism that causes us to feel guilty. Perhaps in most cases, the guilt simply comes from an unrealistic view of what Jehovah expects from us. You know, frankly, there may be times where we imagine that Jehovah demands more than he actually does. The Watchtower once put it this way. This was in the December 1st, 1995 issue. It read, "Why, though, do some feel very guilty about not being able to do more? For some, inappropriate guilt may result from an unrealistic view of what Jehovah expects of us. I had felt that unless it hurts, you must not be doing enough," admitted one Christian. As a result, she set excessively high standards for herself, and then she felt even guiltier when she was unable to reach them. But now let me ask you this. Is that what Jehovah expects of us? That we serve him until it hurts? Is that what Jesus said? No. Jesus said that Jehovah expects us to do all that we can. But you know, there might be a big difference between what you would like to do and what you realistically can do. I mean, I'm sure there are many of you here this morning who would love to be in the full-time ministry, perhaps would love to be serving at Bethel or in some other avenue of special full-time service. But perhaps you can't. And perhaps the reason you can't has to do with family responsibilities. Perhaps it's age, or perhaps it's declining health. And just to illustrate how health can limit us, here's a letter we received a few years ago from a sister. She writes, "I have a syndrome or disease called fibromyalgia. It has severely limited my meeting attendance and service. I am to the point now that I must walk with a cane, and it's hard for me to talk with my mouth for longer than 30 minutes, or even to smile. Recently, I found a loving sister in another congregation who also has fibromyalgia, and she's teaching me how to do telephone witnessing and letter writing. I love it, brothers. For the first time in months, I have reported my time. When I was able to work during the last 6 months, I placed magazines on the bus on the way to work, and I was able to do a little informal witnessing to my workmates. It never amounted to much, but I did what I could. Unfortunately, I never reported the time or the placements. But now, I've had to quit work because I'm in too much pain, and I try to save my energy to attend the meetings or to listen over the phone. I try to do personal study when I can concentrate too. I don't know where I would be without Jehovah, brothers. Most likely, I would have committed suicide because of the stress." This sister is 19 years old. I mean, can any of us say that her service to Jehovah is not whole-souled because it resembles more the widow's coins than Mary's costly oil? Who of us could sit in judgment, right? No, when you do all that you can do in serving God, your service is whole-souled, no more, no less than that of someone serving at Bethel, for example. But how can you know if you personally are doing enough to please God? You know, it's interesting. You may not be the best judge of that for yourself. You know, sometimes when we feel inadequate, we can be so clear and reasonable and balanced with others, and so rigid and merciless with ourselves. You know, sometimes you need to talk to someone else, an elder, a mature friend in the congregation, someone who knows you, your abilities, your limitations, your family responsibilities. Review your schedule together. Sometimes the objective comments of someone you respect can help you to put into proper perspective what you can realistically do in serving God. But please, remember this. Your worth as a person in the eyes of Jehovah is not measured solely by what you do, but by who and what you are. All of Jehovah's servants are precious to him. When you do all that you realistically can do, whether it can be compared to Mary's costly oil or the widow's practically worthless coins, Jehovah is pleased, and there's no reason for you to feel guilty. And you know, when you shed the guilt, the joy in serving God can return. And when you enjoy your service to Jehovah, no one needs to tell you how much you should do. Your heart will impel you to do as much, not as little, as you realistically can do. So if waves of inappropriate guilt should wash over your heart from time to time, never forget what Jesus said of Mary. She did what she could, and that is what Jehovah expects from all of us. Thank you. pleasure for Joanne and I to visit with you here in Livermore. We've been looking forward to this for a long time. And I've told some of you personally, and I would like to say it again here from the platform, just so that you know how much weekends like this mean to us. I mean, we can't say what this may do for you, but we can tell you what this does for us. You see, Bethel is a wonderful way of life, but it is a sheltered way of life, we recognize. And you brothers and sisters are living in the real world, dealing with the realistic pressures and problems that are out there. And you know, it is so important and necessary for us not to lose touch with that. And this is one way that you help us. So getting out here and talking with you, listening to you, gives us a little dose of reality, and we take that home with us. And I can tell you, that helps me to be better at my work back at headquarters. But we know that this would not be possible if the congregation here did not make it possible in bringing us out. So just know, please, that we deeply appreciate it. And I know the other brothers I work with who've been here in the past few years feel the same way. We really do treasure these privileges, and we want to be sure that you know that. So if you don't have to rush out, please come up and say goodbye. We'd love to, chat with you as time may permit. Is there another congregation coming in here? Yeah? At 1 o'clock? Okay, so we're limited, but we'll want to say goodbye. Okay, we're going to conclude with the song listed in the Watchtower. I think it's number 21, is that right? Okay. Hail Jehovah's Firstborn, and then we'll express our thanks to Jehovah.